everyone. I am going to mix the beginner bread recipe this morning. And if you're watching, then you should be able to just follow along and do it how we're doing it. So, the beginner bread recipe is a low hydration, easy to manage recipe that uses only the essential processes. So, when you're first getting started in sourdough, there's tons and tons of processes out there. There's lots of different ways that you can do things, but what we've done for the beginner bread recipe is simplified it down to just what you need, and making it, nice and easy. So if you're joining sort of later in the video, that's fine. You should be able to rewind it and this will be posted. But let's talk about supplies that you need for your beginner bread recipe. So I've got a big mixing bowl because this is a 2-loaf recipe. I have my starter, which was fed and earlier and has been allowed to rise. I've got some water. I just use tap water, but I'm on a well. And I've got some regular all-purpose flour as well as, oh, this is semolina. I wanted spelt. I've got some spelt flour and I've got some salt. So our process for the beginner bread recipe is going to be that we're going to dissolve our starter in our water. We're going to add our flour and salt. We're going to mix it up and we're going to get it ready to go. Hi, Robin. You're welcome. Thank you so much for being here. So if you want to follow along, just grab your supplies. Now, today I'm using a scale. In the shorts on the video on the YouTube channel, there is lots of recipes that are converted to cups. And then also in the Decoding Essential Processes ebook, we've converted all of the recipes to cups. Just for today, I'm going to do grams, but it is there. Hi, Michelle. I'm really glad you're here. Okay, so here's my starter. It is actually a little bit past peak. I fed my starter before I went to bed last night. You want to aim to use your starter at or after peak. The longer past peak you go, the more sour flavor you get. So with the beginner bread recipe, it's designed to be done in one day. So feed your starter before bed, get up in the morning, mix, right? Then do 30 minutes rest and stretch and fold 4 times. Then let it bulk proof on the counter in bulk proofing containers. Pre-shape it, shape it, score it, bake it. Those are the basic essential processes. And what we always say for beginners is just do the basics until you start getting good bread. Then start adding optional and more advanced processes. An example of an optional process is, cold proofing. But we often recommend beginners skip cold proofing for a while because if you mess something up earlier in the bulk proofing stage or whatever it may be, cold proofing is often just going to magnify that mistake. So I'll show you my starter. Nice and happy. Lots of bubbles. So this is, a happy, active starter. So for the beginner bread recipe, we're going to use 120 grams of starter. So I'm just going to measure that out straight out of my starter jar into my bowl. Here we go. Okay. And then we're going to use 680 grams of water. And we can just have a quick little chat about tools here. There's lots of myths out there. It's not true that you can't use metal. It's not true that your flour has to be unbleached. It's not even true that you can't use tap water. If you would drink your water, it's probably fine in your sourdough. If you want to use spring water or filtered water, there's no reason you wouldn't do that. My water, we're on a lake-fed well, so we can actually see the lake in our backyard, and all of our water is coming directly out of the lake. We're in Canada. It's full. There's a spring underneath the lake, so it's actually fantastic water. And we do have a filtration system built in the basement, but we add water softener to our water, which is salt. And this is just what I use, but lots of myths out there. And what we focus on at Sourdough for Beginners is how can we make it easy. Great program here. Thanks. Awesome. Okay, so let's add 680 grams of water. The scale is not necessary. You can make sourdough without a scale, but I do find that it's easier for lots of reasons. One is that most sourdough recipes out there are in grams, and just not having to convert to cups makes things easier. But also, I like being able to just stand here and pour until I see a number on the scale. It makes things more fun for me. But that being said, lots of people don't want to use grams. Lots of people don't have a scale. They don't want to use a scale, and that's fine. We've converted the beginner bread recipe to cups. I think it's in the short section of the channel. And like I said, in the Decoding Sourdough Essentials ebook that we wrote, there's cups conversions in there and sort of explains to you how to do it. So I've taken my starter and my water, I've put them in the bowl, and now I'm just using a whisk to blend the starter into water. I like to give it a really good stir here, and what you'll end up with is like a milky, foamy substance. It's a little bit hard for me to tip the bowl to show you on the video without spilling it everywhere, but I'll attempt it anyway. So here we go. It's got this sort of foamy, milky substance. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 1,000 grams of flour to my starter water mix. You can use any blend of flour that you want, but for beginners, we recommend that you don't go above 20% of a sturdy flour like spelt, rye, whole wheat. The reason for this is that those sturdier flours, there's sort of more advanced processes that come into play there. They need more water, they bulk ferment faster, they're sometimes stickier, they're just a little bit harder to manage. So we recommend that as a beginner, right, master these essential processes. Get the essential processes down, get it so that every day you're just comfortable with the mixing, you know what's happening, you're getting fairly successful loaves, and then start adding these other processes in. So today what I'm going to do, and by the way, between each of these things, when I added my starter, I have my scale at 0. Then I put my scale back to 0, added my water. Now I've got my scale back to 0 again. So I'm aiming for 1,000 grams of flour. So I'm going to use mostly all-purpose flour today. And I'll tell you why I'm not using a precise amount. I actually don't have that much spelt left. So what I'm going to do is just see how much is in this bag. Let's see how much we've got here. Okay, so I was at 391 and now I'm at 555. So that worked out to about 165 grams of spelt. And then I'm just going to top the rest up with the all-purpose flour. Megan just asked, how do I make it more sour? That's a great question. There's 2 ways to do that. The first is to use your starter past peak, right? So what's a starter? It's fermentation. It's essentially, I mean, if you didn't feed your starter, it would become alcohol, right? That's why they call it hooch. So if you feed your starter and it peaks, then it's still got lots of flour that it can eat in there, and it's not that far into the fermentation process. If you wait to use your starter until it's past peak and it's begun to fall, it's eaten through the flour, it's become more alcohol. That will give you a more sour taste. The other way to get a more sour taste is to cold proof your bread. But I did mention earlier that often with beginners, we suggest that they skip cold proofing and bake same day just until they get more comfortable with the process. But cold proofing is going to give you a more sour taste in your bread as well. Joan says, does adding wheat flour make like a wheat bread? Sure. I mean, you could definitely, this is going to be my starter's fed with like a mix of whole wheat flour, all-purpose flour, kind of whatever I have around. I've got all-purpose flour in here. All-purpose flour is still wheat-based. Don't think I would call it a whole wheat bread, but certainly it's adding some good wheat content to the bread. So I'm going to tear my scale back to 0 again, and I'm just going to add 20 grams of salt. So there's lots of different ways to mix your dough, right? And there's more advanced things that you can add. So if you've been out there Googling or you're just starting to learn, then you may have come across words like creating a levain from your starter, or auto-leasing your dough, or waiting till later to add your salt. All of those things are valid, and all of those things have a place in sourdough. What we're saying is just at first, do it the simplest way possible. Get used to how the dough feels, right? And then start deciding, once you really truly understand sourdough and once you've got a good feel for it, then start deciding about whether or not you want to experiment with an autolyse, for example. So an autolyse is where you mix your flour and water together and leave the flour and water sitting for a period of time, anywhere from 30 minutes to 10 hours, so that the water and flour themselves start to ferment, and then mix in your starter, let it sit for a while, then mix in your salt, let it sit for a while. This is a great thing. This is a valid process. It's just way more advanced than it needs to be when you're a beginner and you have no idea what the heck is going on, and it seems so incredibly confusing and complicated. So I've dissolved my starter into my water. I've added 1,000 grams of flour and 20 grams of salt. And now I'm just using my spoon to start blending them together. And I'm going to use my spoon until most of the water's been absorbed by the flour. And then I'm going to use my hands to finish mixing this until it creates a shaggy dough. And then before I end the live today, I'll explain what our next steps are. So what about dissolving the salt into the water before the flour added? Does that change anything? I don't think so. I mean, salt slows down the fermentation process, right? So if you're adding the salt directly to the starter, I guess technically it could, but I don't think so. I think it's probably fine. I think, again, in an advanced process, in an advanced sourdough, it's absolutely going to have an effect. But when you're just trying to get the simplified essential processes down so that you can get comfortable with sourdough and be able to get to those advanced processes, I don't think it's going to hurt anything. That being said, I mean, the way I do it is just to dissolve the starter into the water and add I basically am doing mix the wet ingredients together, then add the dry ingredients. I think it's probably fine either way. Does adding, okay, so let's see, how many loaves are you making? So Michelle, this is a 2-loaf recipe. If you want to only make 1 loaf, you can just split it in half. So the beginner bread recipe is 120 grams of active starter, 680 grams of water, 1,000 grams of flour, and 20 grams of salt. And after the stretching and folding phase, I'm going to separate this into 2 equal loaves and put them into the bulk proofing containers, which I'll show you in just a minute. If you wanted to do only 1 loaf, then just do 60 grams of starter, 340 grams of water, 500 grams of flour, and 10 grams of salt. The beginner bread recipe is a low hydration recipe. Low hydration is easier to manage. It's less sticky. And we recommend that you practice with this. It is going to create a slightly denser bread. Once you've got the essential processes mastered and you're feeling comfortable and your bread's coming out consistently and everything's working, then we suggest you work up to the level 2 hydration recipe, which is in the channel. You can find it, where you increase your starter and your water a little bit to get a fluffier, less dense bread. Okay, so what I've done is I've mixed this up, and as you can see, it sticks to my hands. If I tried to pick the dough up, it tears and rips, and this is fine. This is how sourdough is. So what are our next steps? We are going to stretch and fold this dough with 30 minutes rest in between every single one, 4 times. What are we doing while we stretch and fold? While we're stretching and folding, we're building strength into the bread. We're encouraging the gluten structure to begin forming itself, for the starter to start activating the flour and the water, for everything to sort of bind together. When you're building strength in your bread, when you're experienced and more advanced at sourdough, you can actually feel when enough strength has been built. You might have seen things like the window pane process out there, all of these things, right? And over time, as you build experience, you'll be able to do these things. As a beginner, the safe thing is to stretch and fold 4 times. Usually 4 stretch and folds is enough to build the strength that you want to build. Now, here's what you're going to be looking for as you stretch and fold. So right now, my dough is very shaggy. You saw that it stuck to my hands, it ripped, it tore, it wouldn't stay together. As you do your stretching and folding, you'll actually notice that the dough starts to become smooth, elastic. If you stretch it, it goes back together. It starts to resist being pulled up. It won't rip. It becomes one structure rather than a mix. So that's what we're looking for with stretching and folding. So once that's done, what we're going to do is separate our bread into 2 equal sized doughs. So this one, The beginner bread recipe makes about 2 900-gram loaves. And I'll just sort of talk you through the process here and we'll hang around and then I'll do the first stretch and fold so that you can see what I mean about how the strength starts to develop. So these are Rubbermaid, like inexpensive containers. They come in a 2-pack at Walmart. Glad makes them too. They're 8 cups, 1.89 liters. And these are what I use to bulk proof. So after my stretching and folding is done, I use my scale, I separate my dough into 2 equal loaves, and I push them into these containers. And I push them down nice and tight to the bottom, and then I use a Sharpie, or you can use like a whiteboard marker, whatever you want. But I mark the height of the dough and I mark it the way it truly is. So if it's not touching the edge over here, I'll go down to the bottom with my marker so that I know there was a void, right? And what these do is these let us see how much our dough has proofed, right? So how far is our dough gone? So how much do you want to proof your dough? Bulk proofing happens after stretching and folding on the counter, not in the fridge. And if you're going to skip cold proofing, then you want your dough to double, so a 100% rise. If you're not going to skip cold proofing, if you're going to cold proof, then let your dough rise to about 75% during the bulk proofing phase. After bulk proofing, you're going to pre-shape your bread, shape your bread, and then either cold proof it in the fridge overnight or score it and bake it right away. We recommend you skip the cold proofing for the first couple of times. Timing is feed your starter before bed, get up in the morning, mix your dough somewhere between 6 and 8 a.m. But let's say you mixed at 8. That means you'll be done mixing by about 10 after 8. Every 30 minutes, you're going to stretch and fold 4 times. That's 2 hours. So now it's just slightly after 10. Bulk proofing should take somewhere between 4 and 8 hours. We do not recommend that you bulk proof your dough on the counter overnight. It's usually just way too long and your dough ends up overproofed. And then that's when we see people saying, I went to shape my dough and it was just too sticky. What we recommend is that you let your dough bulk proof on the counter during the day at a time when you can watch it and you can keep an eye on it. When sourdough bulk proofs, it expands in whatever direction it's able to go. So if you're familiar with yeast bread, you know that yeast bread kind of does this thing where it just like becomes a ball and expands like outwards and upwards like this. Sourdough doesn't really do that as much. Once it's proofed, it'll start to dome on top and you'll start to see air bubbles in there. But really what sourdough does is it expands wherever it can expand. And so the reason we don't recommend bulk proofing in a bowl like this is because we hear people say all the time, my dough didn't rise. And what we think is that it did rise. It's just really hard to see because it went from sort of a dough like this and expanded sort of outwards into this big bowl that's getting wider as it goes. And so they end up with overproofed dough, right? So with this bulk proofing, we're going to let that happen in the bulk proofing containers somewhere between 4 and 8 hours. We're going to stop it. We're going to pre-shape. So when we pre-shape, we're using a bench scraper, no water, no flour. All we're doing is just pushing some air and tension into the bread, just getting the bread ready to be shaped. We're going to let it sit after it's been pre-shaped for 20, 30 minutes, and then we're going to shape it into our bread, right? So that's sort of the essential process. These are like the very basic ways to get to a sourdough loaf. And if you follow these processes, if you do them exactly the way that we're saying them, then very quickly you're going to start to get loaves, right? Edible sourdough loaves that spring in the oven, that have an ear, that look really close to how sourdough should look. And then you're going to start saying, okay, well, it's a little bit dense, or oh, I would like to start changing up my flours a little. By then, you'll be comfortable enough with the bread. You'll have built up enough strength in your experience that you'll know sort of how to make those adjustments, and you'll be able to make them slowly over time. So let's pretend that my dough has been sitting here for 30 minutes. Okay, so you just sort of went through the mix process with me. It's been sitting here for 30 minutes. And by the way, in between stretches and folds, I just use like a towel and throw it over my bread like this just so it doesn't get dried out and my cat doesn't sniff it and all that good stuff. Once it goes into the bulk proofing containers, I just put those lids on tight and let it do its thing. So it's been 30 minutes. It hasn't, but let's say it has. And we're going to do our first stretch and fold. And I want to show you what happens with stretching and folding. From the first stretch and fold session to the fourth stretch and fold session, you're going to have a totally different dough. You're going to be able to pick that dough up in the fourth stretch and fold session and bounce it. And it won't stretch down and it won't rip. It'll stay together and elastic. But even within each session, the dough starts to show you some strength. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to gently wet my hand, right? So it's just a little bit damp, sort of down on my hand, not dripping or soaked or anything else. I'm going to scoop under my dough and I'm going to pull it up for the first stretch and fold. And for this one, I'm going to do it exaggerated. You wouldn't really stretch and fold like this, but I just want to show you what happens with the dough. So when we grab it, it breaks, right? It'll stretch way up, right? If I keep pulling on it. So this is how the dough looks at first. So when we do our stretch and fold, all we're going to do is reach underneath the dough and fold it on top of itself, right? And we're going to work our way all the way around the dough, right? And do this. And if you're looking, if you were able to zoom in or feel this dough, you would actually be able to see that even within this one stretch and fold, the dough is starting to get smoother and hold together. You'll also notice it's not sticking to my hands quite as much. It's still sticking, but it's not sticking as much as it was when you first mixed it, right? So now if you watch this, if I wet my hand again, compared to that first stretch and fold that I did, when I pull this up, see how it's resisting? See how when you grab the dough, it's starting to like stay together in one piece? I definitely could rip it if I wanted to. Look. See how at the beginning, when I first mixed the dough, if I grabbed a handful, just a little bit would come out. But towards the end of this stretch and fold, oh, we might be getting a visit from Theo the cat in just a moment here. We'll see. He kind of knows better, but he's always snooping around wondering what's happening. This is the point of stretching and folding. So I like doing these lives, but I wish that I could fast forward sourdough. I've actually talked a lot about trying to get a bunch of doughs in the different stages so I can show you. But I think that these lives are still valuable. If you came on today and you watched this from the beginning and stayed with me, then you have all the tools you need to be able to get a mix together and get through that stretching and folding phase. Once you've done the 4 stretch and folds and you've separated your doughs into the 2 bulk proofing containers and marked their heights, then what you can do is click the description of this video. I've put a bulk proofing success video, a pre-shaping video. I put a link to the Essential Processes book. Everything you need is in there. But you can also scroll through the YouTube channel, and there is like pre-shaping, shaping, baking tutorials, right? You can bake in loaf pans, you can bake in a Dutch oven. There's a million different ways you can do sourdough. But this beginner bread recipe, this basic essential set of processes is really all you need to get good at sourdough. And I think that, it sorts out a lot of the confusing stuff that's out there. The confusing stuff that's out there, 9 times out of 10 is right. It's just that it's out of context, it's advanced, it's difficult. So I hope this helped you today. If you have any questions, if you're watching this live or if you're going to watch it after the fact, post them in the comments. I try to always get in there and answer them. I really love helping everyone. Please subscribe to the channel, and I hope things go well with you with your sourdough. And I'm pretty sure that you're going to be making your own great bread for your family really soon. Talk to you soon. Bye, guys.